Hi guys, Jackie from Famished Farm, and this week we are cooking again. We are working on our recipe stash. That was the recipes that we found as we were starting to declutter our house and our life. And these recipes are things that I have been saving for years and years, if not a decade or more. But we're trying to keep everything in the house, the pantry, the freezer, the refrigerator, everything moving and in rotation. We don't want things to spoil and go bad. So what we're making this week, we're continuing on our healthy menu, and what we've decided to make is a shrimp saute on cauliflower rice from All Recipes. That was really good. A baked fried chicken from food.com, also really good. And our meatless TVP sloppy joes, also from food.com. Now, TVP is one of the ingredients that I have an overstock of, and I've been looking for ways to add it to our weekly menu on Meatless Monday. And this particular recipe is good, but it's not one that will take the place of an existing favorite. So I'll tell you more about that later. But to round out our menu for this week, we're having leftovers of the breakfast for dinner casserole that we made last week in the slow cooker. We're going to do soup and sandwiches because Rod had COVID, so we do hit the soup and sandwiches. We're going to do a pizza with our pizza sauce and our freezer dough that we made a couple months ago. And then burgers will round out the menu. So that's what's cooking this week in my kitchen, and I hope you'll watch along and maybe find a few favorites that you can add to your weekly, bi-weekly, monthly rotation. First up, our shrimp saute from allrecipes.com. And this one, the prep time is not insignificant. It took about 45 minutes, and there's some ways that you can, of course, save some time. It involves dicing of a lot of vegetables. So this onion and the green pepper and the tomato, all called to be diced. And I suppose you could get the onion and pepper and maybe even the mushrooms that come a little later. You could find that in the frozen section already chopped for you, and that would be fine. If not, the mushrooms in the mix with onions and green pepper, you could certainly use the sliced frozen mushrooms, and that would save some time. And get the chopped, either frozen or in the fresh food, the chopped kale. I use kale. The recipe does call for spinach, but you could find that also chopped in the frozen section. So, you know, the first part of this is going to be some time, and I do kind of show you the speeded through version of preparing these vegetables. But everything calls for a, let's see, I think it's all diced. It doesn't really matter in the final product, so if you want these a bigger chop to save you some time, that would be perfectly fine for this recipe. The other thing this recipe calls for that you'll see next up is the first couple of steps are preparing a head of cauliflower into cauliflower rice. I don't even do that anymore. When I see it calling for cauliflower rice later in the recipe, I just buy the frozen, and in this case I have partially steamed it. This meal I am not gonna be eating tonight, so I'm preparing it for the next night, so I kind of partially cook everything. This cauliflower rice and the shrimp. And here I'm adding, I use bone broth. I just made bone broth the night before, but I didn't quite have a cup, so I added some chicken stock and then a little bit of olive oil. And then you're going to use a whole lime, but only half of it in the cauliflower rice mixture. And then I've forgotten I need to dice these mushrooms, and again, slice them. It'll be a lot quicker than dicing. And then the next part of the recipe is basically spicing up your cauliflower rice. It calls for a tablespoon of cumin, and we both felt that that was a little bit strong. You could leave out some of that, but we just left out the peppers and the shrimp saute part of it, so use your judgment. We're going to also salt and pepper, and then we'll take half of the lime and use that. We'll squeeze that into this cauliflower rice, and then of course we're going to give it a good stir. And then we're going to move over to our stovetop, and we're going to start with a couple tablespoons of coconut oil. And I'm using organic, unrefined, so it does have a little bit of the coconut sweetness to it, which is great in this recipe. And we're going to start out by sauteing our onions, tomatoes, and the mushrooms. And basically you're sauteing, but you're going to cook them through to the point where the moisture has been released. So, and I think the recipe called for about 5 minutes to do that. Actually, it says 5 to 10 minutes, and I do think it took the full 10 minutes or a few minutes less for that. So we'll give this a stir, and then we'll just check back on it periodically as it does cook down and the moisture is released. Now, if you chopped all those vegetables, you will want to skip this step, but don't. You do want this vegetable mix pretty dry. And at this point, I realized that I forgot the spinach, or in my case, kale. So it's going to take a few minutes here, and we will get this chopped up to add into the mix. And then we're going to move back over to the skillet where I give things another stir, and it's pretty dry. So now comes what I consider kind of the secret ingredient to this recipe. It's almond flour, and it takes 3 tablespoons, and you're just going to mix that up into the vegetables and kind of let that meld for a minute or two. And then that's the remaining half of our chicken stock. We'll add that, and again, we're just going to let this simmer for roughly another 5 minutes or so. And then we'll come back and season with our garlic powder, salt, pepper, oregano, and chili powder. And I did, instead of using the tablespoon of chili powder that it called for, I did just use half of that, half a tablespoon, and the remaining half of the lime. And then we're gonna get it doesn't ever really tell you when to put the green peppers in, but this is when I choose to. And that kale is just gonna wilt down, and that will take a couple of minutes to wilt the kale down. And the shrimp I'm using today is just from Walmart, a bag of raw jumbo shrimp, and it is a full pound bag. I was surprised for a couple bucks more. Worth it, in our opinion. Rod and I can eat a pound of shrimp with no problem. And you're just going to thaw that, and then you're just going to stir fry or saute this shrimp until you want this done. But in our case, again, we're not going to eat this tonight, so I'm going to leave it just barely shy of being done so I can reheat this later. This was awesome. Like I said, I'm going to put it in the refrigerator in a couple storage containers. It was delicious. Our next recipe from food.com is the TVP Vegan Sloppy Joes. And again, I'm trying to use TVP to use up the overstock that I have in my pantry. Texturized vegetable protein is a soy product, and I've got that for long-term food storage. Now the recipe comes together pretty quick. You want to use tomato paste or tomato sauce. I have used the stick blender on just a can of my homegrown tomatoes. And then we're going to move, once the veggies are chopped, moved over to the stovetop, we're going to put a little bit of olive oil, and we're going to saute these vegetables. And it just tells you to saute, and then you're basically, once they're translucent, going to add all the rest of the ingredients and simmer this together for 20 minutes. Now, I make this very early in the day, so once I start adding my ingredients, this is literally going to saute, or it's going to be on low heat, warming for several hours. So the flavors have a lot of time to meld together. What we did find is, again, we're trying to find uses for this TVP that I'm just putting in the recipe, and I did rehydrate and deflavorize my TVP. If you are using unflavored TVP, you will want to add the 3/4 cup of boiling water the recipe calls for. And then we're gonna salt and pepper. That was chili powder I added before. A half a tablespoon of soy sauce and a half a tablespoon of mustard. Oh, I am cutting this recipe in half too, just FYI. The recipe calls for a cup and a half of the TVP. I use just 3/4 cup. And then we're gonna use a half a tablespoon of mustard, and it calls for a half a tablespoon of sugar, which I just use my packet of Splenda. And then we'll mix this all together and let those flavors start melding. Now, if you're in a pinch, you could certainly cut down on the 20 minutes to simmer. I would just be tasting that TVP, and as soon as it started incorporating the flavor into the TVP, then you're done. And our last recipe is the baked up fried chicken, low fat, from food.com. And I thought this was going to be another super quick recipe until I reread the directions, and it does call for, or it gives you a hint later in the directions that it really makes the chicken tender if you let this marinate in the fridge for 4 hours. So that is what we did, but we start with just an egg white and a half a cup of low-fat buttermilk, and I think I'm using whole buttermilk here. It's not going to change the recipe at all to use either one. And then we'll start on our breading, and that's a half a cup of all-purpose flour, some salt, garlic powder. We're going to use oregano, chili powder, and kind of a surprise ingredient. I guess it might be similar in some of the Chinese recipes that call for fried food, is 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And that gets added into the flour. And then you're just gonna simply mix up the flour, and you'll notice I'm using a Ziploc bag. So just smush that all together to incorporate all those spices into the flour. And here we are going to add the chicken into our buttermilk and egg white mixture. And then we're just going to give this a stir, make sure everything is submerged and coated in that buttermilk. And then we'll put some saran on it, and it goes into the fridge for 4 hours. So after our 4-hour timer rang, then we're going to prepare to get these on a baking sheet. We've preheated the oven to 450, and it's simply going to be to dredge or shake, like shake and bake. Shake these chicken breast, which I didn't really mention. I had a thin sliced chicken breast, about 1.25 pounds. It calls for 6 boneless chicken breast. I would say plenty of flour mixture if you use full size. So that would be, 2 smaller chicken breasts or 1 Gigano one. This seemed like plenty of flour to coat these pieces of chicken. And we're just gonna, give them a shake, pull them out with the tongs, and put them on our baking sheet. I know I do this every time I have a cooking day, but reread the recipe, read it. It does call for a quick brush with olive oil. I have olive oil spray, so I'm put them in the oven, immediately pull them out, and spray them with the olive oil. My recipe calls for 30 minutes at 450 for the full chicken breast. My thin sliced ones took 20 minutes. This shrimp saute was just a real surprise. It was delicious. Now, my husband probably wasn't quite so thrilled with it. Anytime he sees greens like that, it's not his favorite thing, but he does like shrimp. So while it won't go in the weekly rotation, I'm sure I can slide it by him every month or so. So using the convenience foods, cut up vegetables, it will cut down on your prep time, but plan 45 minutes for this to prepare if you're doing the recipe as written. Make whatever shortcuts you like, just be sure to put that almond flour in. That was great. So the TVP Vegan Sloppy Joes was our least favorite recipe of the week. When I checked it for seasoning, I knew Rod was just not going to be on board. So I did add our favorite Sloppy Joe ingredients, Worcestershire sauce, and a tiny hit of liquid smoke. That still was not enough to make this throw away our favorite recipe from Mom. It's just never going to replace that recipe, but it was good enough that we ate it and enjoyed it. It's just we won't be making it again. So this was very good and very simple and easy to make. The recipe does call for butterfat, buttermilk rather, so if you don't have it, make your own or maybe splurge for a small carton. I use the chicken breasts, the big ones, but I had cut them in half. It calls for 6 of them. I used 1.25 pounds. Everything else is staples that you're going to have on hand, except for maybe olive oil spray that I use. You can use olive oil also. It was delicious. It will go in the rotation. Oh, and I'm going to serve this with homemade ranch, but you could use barbecue sauce or whatever your preferred dipping sauce is.